recording just started. Yeah, there we go. I should have done that before. But I am a core faculty in the Counseling at Northwestern program. I am an Afro-Latinx woman who is really interested in destigmatizing mental health for our communities. And this is something I'm really passionate about. And I'll just let you, Ladylanis, introduce yourself before we kind of jump into what we have for everyone today.
Mm-hmm. Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to share what I acquire with my work and as a counselor. As Dr. Dipre mentioned, my name is Ladylanis Grullon Cepeda, and I'm a licensed professional counselor associate in the state of Connecticut. I'm currently working as an outpatient clinician, working with children and adolescents with diverse mental health challenges. And I'm currently working on getting my Ph.D. in counseling and supervision at Walden University. So the topic for today, as you probably know, is using trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy with undocumented Latinx youth as a case study. We're going to try to make this presentation as interactive as possible. So we're going to provide the information, and then when we get to the case study, you guys are going to go into a breakout room in small groups, and then we're going to come together as a large group to discuss what you guys come up with according to the prompting that we will provide to you.
So I just wanted to take a minute to kind of just go over our learning objectives and then kind of give you a little bit of background what prompted this work. And I will be transparent that our work here is really from Ladylanis' heart and soul, her work with clients. And our goal is to actually use this presentation as a way to also get the word out, but also receive feedback from you, because we're looking into developing a manuscript and publishing it, because it is important for us to have this kind of work out there. So as you are here listening to this, I hope that you are, or at least we hope that you're learning, but also sharing your thoughts and feedback so that we could improve this work. So the first thing I wanted to highlight here is that we want to briefly examine research-supported practices for working with undocumented children and youth. So in a little bit, I'll present some work and what has been found to be useful around working with undocumented children and youth. Also, we want to provide recommendations to increase awareness of this underserved population. And lastly, increasing counselors' competencies in working with undocumented minors in the US using trauma-focused CBT. So that's really what we're hoping to achieve in this time that we have together. When it comes to the background and the information we know that there's been a growth in an undocumented population in the United States generally. As of 2018 or so, approximately 11 million undocumented immigrants, 80,000 children alone. That's a huge number. I was recently just looking in the border patrol customs people, I can't remember their name. I was looking at it, and they show monthly updates and how many people are crossing the border. And there's an estimate of around daily, there's about 400 to 500 people, children specifically, that are detained at the border trying to cross. And that's a huge number nationwide. So it's important for us to kind of really important for us to be mindful of, because it turns out that we will be working with children, undocumented youth, and their families. Next, I wanted to also address this piece that, you know, these reports have shown that the children and the families have high rates of trauma as they experience high stress, obviously, not only for the migration process itself, but they're also vulnerable in their countries of origin. They experience lack of security, separation from families as well. And it's just, the list goes on and on, but these are the pieces that are really emphasized. We also need to think about that for youth clients, they need to process their trauma. It is essential for clinicians to take a trauma-informed approach while considering the concepts of episodic memories, which refer to life events and experiences, and semantic memories, which are conceptual memories about the world. So you have to be really mindful, especially because youth are not developed yet and may not have a language to describe these memories. So it's important for us to be mindful of those pieces from a trauma-informed lens. Additionally, we need to think about how processing traumatic experiences can be most beneficial when you are processing them through the client's primary language. Because the body does keep score, right? And you're able to really process that work when you are more attuned to yourself. The last thing I wanted to highlight is that there's a limited research on how practitioners can support this population by mitigating stressors and supporting them with transitions. Though one potential approach that has been backed by the literature has been trauma-informed CBT, though there's limited research and hence why we're here, honestly. So we want to really highlight a couple of pieces that Ladylanis has found to be useful to her work. It hasn't been that she has completely followed every single step, but she has been creative in her approach with her knowledge of this population and what's out there in the research. Okay, so I'll just share that and I'll send it back to you, Ladylanis.
Okay, so right here we can jump into the case study. As you can see, this is a preteen. She's 12, Honduran female. Right here you can see that she experienced sexual abuse as her main trauma. So that happened in April 2022, and the perpetrator was her step uncle. And then after, well, she came to the United States in April, I'm sorry, in 2022, and then 2 months after the sexual abuse happened. But she also experienced more trauma when she was crossing the border from Mexico to the United States, and she was kidnapped during her second trip. She tried to cross with her mother, so she was kidnapped with her mother locally. According to her report, she only witnessed someone dying. There was no rape on her case and someone else. But this kid experienced like a lot of trauma, and they were within a very short period of time. According to the kiddo's report. So before I jump into my intervention and CBT, I'm giving you a little background about this approach and what I utilize as a culturally modification for this client. I would like you guys to kind of like think about the case. We going to do some breakout room for you to discuss with your small group about how the client is presenting. From your approach, what practices will you use when working with this particular client and family? And from there, we're going to come back and talk as a group. And then from there, I will talk about what I have found helpful to working with this particular population. Well, in this case, like this client per se.
And while I work on putting you into breakout rooms, I'll also share a link before I send you out, so you have the case to reference back. And as Ladylanis just shared, the goal is for you to start kind of brainstorming and thinking about, based on your own work, what are areas that you think are important to address? What is missing? What's really an approach that you could take with the client, a modality, for example, anything that you find would be helpful for this client is what we're looking to do. So give me 1 second and I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. And then Ladylanis, will you be able to share the link? How long? You will be in there for 10 minutes, okay? And we're gonna put you in rooms of 2 to 3 people in there, so you're able to really talk to each other. Let's see, create.
Please let us know if you're able to access the document.
I think you send them to me. Let me copy. Yeah. There you go. You sent it to me. Perfect.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If you could give us a thumbs up, you're okay. If you could give us a thumbs up that you have, yes, thank you. Okay, I'm going to send you into your breakout rooms and we will be bouncing around. You need access. Okay. 1 second. I'll give you that as soon as I let you all in. Thank you for letting us know. Okay. If you don't feel comfortable unmuting yourselves or because you have noise in the background, please feel free to share your thoughts and feedback or approach in the chat as well. We're really just interested to think about and have a conversation for a few minutes around what stood out about the case and how would you approach this case specifically.
Or if you have any questions in terms of like more information, I'm more than happy to provide that for you as well.
In our breakout room, we discussed maybe like other additions to TF-CBT, so EMDR or some kind of somatic work with the child and mom. Maybe even getting mom access to individual counseling outside of like conjoint sessions and things like that. And then also someone brought up a great point about basic needs. So ensuring that the family has basic needs met before you even get started on trauma work or getting into the depths of trauma work, just because it's hard to focus when you don't have any food or have anywhere to stay and there's so many needs that you're needing to have met. One of my questions was even how tricky this could be if someone, if this abuse hadn't been reported and we were obligated to report something like that since it happened in the US, and how that would kind of maybe create more issues or like distrust with the child and the family.
You brought up like really good points, which I will address in my presentation as well during when I start talking about the intervention and some adaptation that I did or some points that I took into account when working with her. But in terms of like reporting, there is kind of like a law that protects undocumented youth when they have been abused or when they have experienced any abuse in the States, that parents can actually report that to the police and DCF, and they will not take into account or ask the family, are you documented or are you illegal? So it's not going to be like further exploration on that. I think it's just like, because in the case in Lila's case, that what happened, like mom kind of like knew about the sexual abuse because of her cell phone, right? She went through her cell phone, she saw pictures, she saw the messages. So mom took the initiative to call the police, and then the police called DCF, Child Protective Services. And then from there, the process started with having an advocate for the family. But everything went very smooth because mom was very communicative. She was cooperative with the authorities, and they didn't ask her about her background, which in this case was like very, very useful. And as you mentioned, yeah, the family can actually apply for the U visa. This a process, it takes time. Like this kiddo's still working to get hers. But there's some opportunities that the family can ask for asylum, and then the mom, as the main provider for this kiddo, will be protected under the kid's U visa process, since she needs the support of the mom. We don't want to cause more trauma, right, by having to send mom back to her country. So there could be some supports. I know it can be very tricky and very distressing for the families, but it's just like informing them that yes, you are undocumented, but you have rights still. Any other thoughts? Thank you so much for sharing, Liliana.
I'll read what's in the chat. Melissa said, me and my partner discussed that the first step would be to establish child's safety, whether there's court involved due to the incident with her step uncle, as well as checking for suicide or self-harm ideation. Thank you for sharing that. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Like this kiddo at the beginning of her trauma, she started experiencing suicidality, very minor. There was no intent. It's just like the thought of like not being here, right? Being alive. And then because of the emotional distress, when we start working on the trauma piece and keeping secrets, with I will talk a little bit more during the intervention piece, kind of like agitated that emotional distress, and she actually engaged in self-harm one time. But just like having the family mentioning, right, the safety, enhancing safety, how to so how she can protect herself, but also what strategies she can use to kind of just like share those like distressing emotions instead of like harming herself, which during the her work with me, that never happened according to her report and mom's report. It only happens once, and it was because of, again, the distress of like keeping a secret from her family in general. Okay. Claudia, yeah, you can just unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say that something that comes up for me is that the preparation in regards to having those skills before really getting into the narrative of the trauma, I think takes priority in cases like this, because with the hypervigilance of not knowing about your immigration process, or being really up in the air in regards to housing, or knowing what your rights are, sometimes meeting providers that don't speak your language really could hurt that trust and that ability to come up with those coping skills that are needed to go through trauma-focused CBT.
Yes, I love that. And it's also like thinking about learning those skills, but also having someone as a support system, right? That can prompt you, okay, you have learned this in therapy. This is something that we're going to try together, which is very challenging for this community, that mental health is still a big stigma. Sharing with someone else outside the family is still something that can make counseling more challenging for the clinician that's doing the work, but also for the family having like those internal conflicts as well. Okay, so I go, if nobody else have something else to share, I'm going to talk about a little bit my.
We have one more. Can I share one more? Okay. Sorry. Our forum discussed that another important step will be to develop rapport in this situation. This is perfect leeway for you. So, and how would we go about it, right? Would this be mother-daughter counseling with only her or both? Would it take a long time to get this 12-year-old to trust any adults after what she has endured, including the mother?
Amazingly, mom and daughter had a very healthy relationship. The only issue was that the daughter didn't disclose to mom what was happening because of shame, because of the conflict that she will bring to the family, mostly from the stepdad side, which, yes, it happened. It was a very difficult situation for the mom and the daughter to be in. Because they needed resources from the stepfather, so from mom's partner. So definitely that report was there, which again make the work a little bit easier. And I will talk a little bit more about how I was able to develop rapport with this client, because they were able to come to every session. It took approximately like 20 sessions for her, just because mom was very engaged and supportive. It will have been more challenging if mom would be like the more unengaged parent, and okay, I do not care about this, but mom was very willing to do the work. And I think that phase step of like engaging and developing rapport was what made this work so much easier for me as a clinician, and also as the family as well, because this is a very difficult case, because there's so much trauma involved that during that process we have to break everything into pieces and break each trauma. I know when we work with trauma, we just do one narrative for the work, but it's just like making into like subsections, where she will process each of her trauma within one big trauma narrative. Okay, so for those who are not familiar with CBT, it's just a short treatment that has helped children and families recover from upsetting thoughts, feelings, and behavior associated with trauma exposure. Right here, you guys can see that there are different components. The the module actually has specific subsections of like these components, but to make it a little bit easier, I kind of come up with like the initial phase, the stabilization phase, and then we have the action phase. So there's different components to TFCBT. We have the assessment where we use the history, so we explore how much trauma the kid has been exposed. Then we do an assessment of her symptoms. In her case, working with mom was key. So mom did her assessment and the kiddo as well did her assessment in order for me to see where in the chart she kind of like fell within PTSD. And according to her symptoms, she was very high in the PTSD line. So we have developing rapport, as I mentioned before, was very, very important. And in order for me to do this, was basically just listening to the client, right? Making sure her basic needs were met, talking to mom about her religion, what their cultural perspective help as well. The acculturation stress, right? Because the kiddo has been in the United States just for a few months. So outside of her PTSD symptoms and stress, we have the acculturation stress of learning a new language, not being able to be in school because when she arrived to the States, not having health insurance. So a lot of things that as a clinician was very important to advocate for this family and connect them with resources that they could trust. Because if the client doesn't trust you as the provider, they will not trust another authority figure because that's how they see us. So it's just like going down to the level we are humans too, and then just listening to their concerns. And of course, those needs, they need to be met before we jump into the trauma work, because we can do more harm than good at that point. Going back to the components, like they're very self-explanatory. So we do the psychoeducation about trauma. Also, I implemented acculturation stress education for the kiddo and the mother as well, so they can normalize that even though they're going through this experience, the other things as well. Then educating them that the experience was trauma. They were very foreign to that term. They thought that whatever they went through in their country, their native country, crossing the borders to the United States, and then the sexual abuse, those were just like events, right? But now that they have some type of connection in terms of like their psyche, their psychological and emotional well-being, so that was like very helpful to normalize all those symptoms, and of course bringing it back to the acculturation stress as well. Parenting, in this case, the kid didn't have any misbehaviors, so it was mostly somatic, internalized feelings, relaxation, affective modulation, cognitive coping, and then we would jump into the action, which is just like developing that narration where we do not fix what the kid says. We just go with what they have to share about their experiences and from their perspective. And then we move into like the cognitive processing. In the case for this kiddo, in vivo didn't have to happen for those who are familiar. And then we do the conjoin. For the parent session, it was very important to me with mom individually, because mom was very emotionally reactive to what happened to her kid. Of course, as a loving parent and caring parent, it was very typical to have that response. But it was very important for her work with me to start talking about her beliefs in terms of like having that peace, because mom did a lot of self-blaming. She would blame because step uncle kind of like offered himself to take care of the kid, right, while mom was working. So mom accepted it. So she was blaming that she allowed the abuse to happen. So a lot of conversation in terms of like spiritual support, how in her case, how God sees the action of the perpetrator. So that gave mom a little bit of ease, as well as the work with like normalizing, and then mom learning the relaxation strategies that her kiddo was learning as well to work as a team. So working with mom individually was key, so the kiddo would not see that response and increase that blaming. Oh, my mom's crying because of what happened to me. The language was also another adaptation that was very important. This kiddo has the opportunity to work with me fully in Spanish. That is my native language. That's also her native language. However, it was challenging because of the linguistic piece. Even though we spoke the same language, there's some variations in terms of the dialect. So asking the kiddo, how do you say this? And then making sure and keeping notes and or mental track of like, this kid used this term in her narrative. So I know what it means, so I don't keep asking her. And I try to kind of like use her language when she express her trauma and her experiences as well as emotions. This culture in specific do not have a extensive emotional language, so it was difficult for the client to kind of like express everything and kind of like differentiate between anger and maybe feeling disappointed. So it was very important to work with what the client understood and making this like more comprehensive for the family as well, because I have to take into consideration mom's learning education level. Mom didn't finish middle school, therefore I have to kind of like work with how she understood things. So working with that, and then role play was key for this kiddo in terms of like enhancing safety and work on that machismo and respeto perspective that is in within this culture. Because this was an authority figure, was a family member, right? We have to respect, we cannot say no, we can share secrets, right? Within outside the family. So working with her on like just normal role playing, like if you go to the gas station and someone says something inappropriate to you, how can you deal with this? And what steps can you take and who you can go to, right? Because it's just like those things that keeping a secret between just me and the person or me and my mom, and then the parents sometimes reinforce that, as well as like keeping secrets because we don't want someone else to know about what happened with us. So working on that piece was like very important with his family as well. So those were kind of like the little adaptations, the language. I have to TFCBT, there's a lot of resources out there in Spanish, but for this client in particular, even though it was in Spanish, I had to do some modifications in terms of like her own way to communicate. Visuals were very important, but again, it's just like focusing on what the client needs, adapting with what works for them as well. And something that this approach has is that we can go back and forth. We can be very flexible with approaches with everything except the narrative, right? We have to ensure that the client is safe, they're stable, they have the tools. So when they start being exposed to that narrative, they have what they need. In the case of this kiddo was that she prolonged to share her narrative with mom for too long, right? Respecting the kid. But then it's just like something that I should have done a little bit more now going back is encouraging a little bit more for her to share that with mom. Because she was keeping that secret, it caused a emotional distress, and that's why she started cutting. It happened one instance. She put that in her narrative as well, and she was able to share that with her mom, and it was very helpful to having those like little changes and tweaks for working with this kid and utilizing a evidence-based practice for her. Okay. Any questions or clarifications? Oh, I love the same tray. I can see that the non-verbal treatment. I actually utilize that. I'm a fan of Centray. I can only see it on the messages. It helped her a lot in terms of like regulating herself, right? Because during the first phase of like developing that rapport and talking about the trauma and providing psychoeducation about trauma, being with the scent and the movement actually help as well, or making slime that help as well in terms of like being one with herself, understanding how calm she felt, the difference between being hyper aroused and then being calm was very useful. So she would start knowing the differences between those two states. And then when she needed to start identifying those reminders and how her body kind of like reacted to those reminders in order to utilize the skill before she went on this rabbit hole of like feeling very tense or stressed. Okay. So treatment outcome. Can you share the screen again, Dr. Dipre? Thank you. So for this kiddo, as I mentioned, she experienced a significant reduction of her post-traumatic symptoms, as well as mom, like the self-blame kind of like decrease as well. She developed trusting. It was very challenging towards adults, mostly her teachers, male teachers. It was very challenging for her, but she was able to, little by little, I have the opportunity to again, that exposure for her to talk about with male counselors. When she used to walk down the hallway, she would talk to a male counselor, and then I would ask her how she felt. So a lot of exposure for this kiddo was very helpful. Role play, as I mentioned before, was helpful as well. And then we have the clinical work, that enhancing that relationship is key. We're working with this population that they have so many things in mind, right? They have the legal status. This person is going to share what is happening to me. One of her main concerns was like, if I ever going to share her narrative, which a lot of encouragement. That's something that we're going to the story at the end of treatment. I do not share your narrative. We can burn it, delete it, whatever you want to do, but that's something that I do not share. In terms of like her scores, I have to report them to kind of like the trauma, the TFCBT kind of like tracker. So I talked to her about that. I informed the family about that and why I had to do it and why it was helpful for them and other people in their position as well. So just like being very honest and transparent before doing the work is very important, because the family starts seeing you as another authority that it could cause damage to my legal status, or deportation can happen. So being very transparent and understanding is very important as well. Is there anything else that you want to add, Dr. Dipre?
There we go. I lost the button for a second. The thing I'm sitting with the most around this specifically is the emphasis too, when you're looking at the client's outcome and your discussion around a culture of stress. This is something we don't typically talk about, but we recognize that trauma comes from many experiences. It could be one experience, but also, I think, as someone put in the chat, the multiplicity of trauma that this client has experienced and the strain that has placed on the relationships with others, including the mom, right? And thinking about how can we frame this in a way that is digestible and not as stigmatizing. So even in that way, we could think about how this family and this child in particular had positive outcomes and also had language that was not negative or pathologizing around what their experiences were. And I just want to emphasize that point when it comes to working with anyone, and in particular with Latinos in general, because there's such a high stigma, and we're not only doing the work with this one client, but we're also thinking about how we're serving this community in general. So that's, I think, what I would add in here. And with that being said, do you mind if I stop sharing the screen?
Yeah, of course.
And I want to invite now time for questions. We have about 10-ish minutes or so, but questions, thoughts, now that you have had the opportunity to listen about this case. New questions came up, new thoughts, and incorporation of other things that could also be helpful for working with this particular client or similar presenting clients. What would you do had she been totally unresponsive, aggressive, or hostile? That's a great question.
Yeah. In this case, I will kind of like explore the functionality of that behavior, right? Because in her case, Well, the way that I learn about trauma is that there's two kind of like types, right? You have the kid who's going to be very aggressive, very hypervigilant, do not touch me, do not see me, right? Everything that you say or do, they will perceive that as an aggressive response because of their perception, right? If it's complex trauma that this kid has gone through, it's the brain. The brain has been rewired to kind of like perceive an adult figure or someone as a threat, right? We have the 3 Fs, the fight, flight, freeze response. Now we have the fawn response as well. So actually 4. So we have to kind of like see, why is this kiddo being aggressive? How is this kiddo perceiving me or perceiving the authority figure? And then it's just working on that parenting piece before we start TFCBT, right? Supporting the parent or whoever the guardian is with understanding the kid's behavior. Where is the behavior coming from? Where does it happen most of the time? Does it happen at school? Is it because of a reminder, a trauma reminder that is triggering that behavior, right? Because let's say your trauma happened during the winter time, it's getting too cold, you were sexually abused, the room was very cold. That's a trauma reminder, right? So the brain automatically is going to go back to that state of like fighting. So now we have to kind of like work towards little by little in providing that psychoeducation, but also working, if it happens at school, the provider needs to support the school, like the school staff, right? Talking, communicating, advocating for the kid to make sure the staff understand that this is not a kid that you can just touch, right? Some staff say like, hey, to kind of like get the kid's attention. Touch can be a trauma reminder and can provoke that. The word no, we don't know how this kid, again, it's just like identifying what it's causing the behavior and what is the kid gaining, or it's just like a defensive mechanism. I don't want adults to get close to me, so let me be nasty so they can just walk away, right? So it will be very important to kind of, and then just allow silence. Like what I do, and I love in working with teenagers mostly, is that if they don't want to talk, they don't have to talk. We can spend the 45 minutes looking at each other, and I will be okay with it. And if you try, they will break. They will talk because they are so uncomfortable with it. And you have to go with them. And we don't want them to see us as, oh, here we go, another adult that's going to tell me what to do, that is going to try to change me the way I am because I am who I am, right? So having that mentality, if a session can be very productive, even though if nothing has been spoken, you can just see their body language and you can start learning kind of like the how uncomfortable they can be with silence, and then just use it as a observation. That's how you can put in your notes. It's like insurance is a difficulty for our notes sometimes, right? You can just put it as observing or evaluating, and you will be able to see that the kid will start talking little by little or do things, or just like playing catching, like throwing the ball back and forth. That can also engage the kid in being like in connectedness, right? Because we don't know if there's some attachment difficulties as well. So just like engaging them in movement, it would be very important than just like talking therapy.
And I have one additional question to that, and then one more that was sent privately. So if you have questions, private message me too. But what if the child was aggressive, unresponsive, and what about when you add that with the parent being uncooperative as well?
Yeah.
How would you have approached that?
So with TFCBT in general and other approaches as well, the parent doesn't have to be part of it. If the parent is doing more damage than good, it's not supportive, does not believe the kid, you can be that supportive adult. The kid can work with you in terms of like the trauma narrative, narrating, and they can narrate it to you, because that can be also healing because they're breaking and you're supporting them. And there's at least one adult, one consistent adult that is listening to me and is believing of what I'm saying. Of course, going back home, it would be challenging, but at least there's one person or two people that are believing them and that are actively listening to what they're saying. So the parent doesn't have to be, unless there's some other challenges that we have to explore why the parent doesn't want to be involved, right? And then just like kind of like tweaking and looking at the stemming issue, if the parent is not the perpetrator, right? Because we need to have the non-offensive parent in treatment in this case.
Next question is, just out of curiosity, did you practice DBT, emotional regulation skills, with the client?
I actually did. So it was very important to kind of like focus on those like sensations, right? And how it's connected to the body and how everything is just like you mentioned at the beginning, Dr. Dipre, and also read the book, The Body Keeps the Score, right? We have to be attuned, mindful of how our body feel in order for us to kind of like see those red flags. And that was very helpful for her. That emotional regulation, being mindful, use a lot of mindfulness and kind of like scanning her body. I used therapist aid for her. But of course, with some of the music, yes, but then I have to use the translation. And sometimes I recorded myself and I send it to the family via email, or mom just recorded me, and then they will practice the skill with my voice in the recording just because of the language purposes. And I know there were things out there in YouTube and everything, but I wanted her to have a familiar voice telling her what to do. So she will kind of like go back to the session, that safe place that she developed with me. And then her mind will be able to kind of like track how, have that connection between this person, her voice, and then the way that I feel when I'm there. So developing that safe haven for her.
We don't have any more questions at the moment. Let's leave space for one more if possible, and if not, we could just end here. But we do hope that this session was helpful for you. It's absolutely helpful for us to talk this through and really share a space in which we're talking about our work, because oftentimes we rely so much on what's out there and what's published, and not really on what is actually happening in the counseling room with our clients. So any more questions, or we are feeling okay? Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for sharing the space.
Thank you so much for your time. This was very helpful in terms of like, and I hope you guys can provide feedback at some point as well. But thank you so much for listening and helping us and helping the community and the work that you guys do as well. All right.
Take care.
Bye.